to another video tutorial with Mr. White. What I'm going to do with this video is break it up into several small parts, but keep it in real time so that you get to see my entire working process. Now, when I start with a blank page, I'm going to use the compositional technique called the rule of thirds. We talked about that in our composition practice exercise. Now, this paper is 12 inches wide, and I know that my hand is approximately 4 inches wide, so I can use that 3 times as a rough measurement. Now, afterward, I can also compare, and that's what I'm going to have to do on the vertical side. I'm going to take what I think is a good guess of what 1/3 is between my 2 fingers. I'll line up my 2 fingers on the other hand to be the same distance, and I will stack them. One with my left hand on the bottom, my right hand right above that, as you see in the video. And as I'm doing that, when I remove my left hand and put it back on top of the right hand, I'm able to assess how much space I overestimated or underestimated the size to be. And it turns out that I thought that my sections were a little bit too big, so the top one, as we can see, is not big enough. So I'm going to make both of them a little bit smaller. I'm going to do that same process again. Stack 1, 2, 3, and that looks about right. So I will mark for the top and bottom of my 2 1/3 mark lines. I'll do the same thing on the other side, as you're seeing right now. Now, once I have those lines developed and I've placed them with taking a moment or two to get a rough estimate at least, you could measure if you'd rather, that might be quicker, but I like to use an approximation and get used to looking at the size of things. I find that helps me a lot. Once I have that framework drawn in, and I know that I'm going to draw a scene of a marsh, something close to home like here in Scarborough, I'm going to set the top of the 2 horizontal lines as my actual horizon. So that is going to be where the sky meets the ground. Now, the ground, of course, has trees growing out of it sometimes, so those are going to go slightly above the horizon, but make no mistake, those are still extending into the sky. And then beneath that, I'm going to put a marshy scene. So I'm going to guess that there's some kind of a river running through the marsh, and I'm going to make that have some organic, rough, and kind of bumpy, shore-looking edges. I'm going to place the sun on one of the intersections between a vertical and a horizontal guiding 1/3 line. And then I'm going to place opposite that on the far corner of that sun, I'm going to place a picture of myself in a kayak. Now, I'm fishing, and this reminds me of an evening I had in the summer just a few short weeks ago. It's very pleasant, but you might put any other sort of a thing in there. A kayak and me fishing is just what I thought of. You're welcome to put some kind of a bird or an alien space shuttle or whatever works for you, but think about putting something down there. If you don't put anything, that's okay too. What we're trying to do now is make our scene, to draw it out using the rule of thirds to develop our composition and at least giving ourselves a rough idea of how we're going to make this work. After that, we're going to color. And when we color, as when we paint, we're going to try to start and paint from the background and work forward. This helps because things that are forward and closer to us, we have more freedom in the way we place them. They're often larger, they have more detail, so it's going to help us to color the background and move forward. Also, it helps that the background is further away from us, from our actual physical body, so that when we are coloring it, we're able to color from the top of the page down so we don't rub our hand in the mess as we're coloring the more detailed parts. I'm going to make this a sunset, as you can tell by the sun. So I'm going to use a bunch of sunset colors, yellows, oranges, reds, some violets. I'm going to get some nice dark midnight blue, and I'm going to have some black in there as well for just the very edge. I'm going to work from the background forward, and for the whole page, I'm going to first do a light pressure layer of color, and that's going to let me set up and see how the colors all look together. It's going to let me correct any errors that I have, and it's going to let me make some really nice blending. And we're going to see some of that really beautiful, careful, mixed, multicolor blending in the sky. And as we're coloring, we're using a light colored, a light pressure layer, and we are also going to take our time to continue using the same direction of mark making that radiate out of the sun. We know that the light is coming out of the sun, and so we should use a long mark, dragging our color away from the sun and getting progressively darker and more reddish and orangish. Starting with yellow in the sun, it goes to orange, then to red, then to some sort of pink perhaps, or violet. Certainly some kind of a violet as we head toward the edge of the page. We're going to get into a midnight blue and then even a little bit of black. This is an art piece. It doesn't have to be exactly super photorealistic. Maybe in real life the black wouldn't come out for a little while. I don't care. I like to make this how I want to make it. Now, I'm also going to use some pink to draw some clouds over on the other side of the sky, just to take some space up, make something a little bit more interesting. Then, once I have those plotted in, I'm going to switch again to another color and continue with my light pressure layer of color, emanating away from the sun toward the outer limits of the sky, bringing a little bit of the purple in over to the right-hand side, just like I am to the left. Once I have my whole sky filled in to a light pressure layer, I'm going to then start to fill in the tree line, the border of, the top of the ground and the trees growing out of it that border on the sky as well as the river. And with this, I'm going to use a nice foresty kind of green. For the base color, I'm going to use light pressure, but instead of emanating out from the sun, I'm going to use a vertical up and down, a little bit of a staccato sort of hand motion. When I'm doing this, I'm thinking about the texture, the shape, the size, and density of trees, trying to keep that same sort of a texture. After that, I'm going to use a light blue as the base color for my water, and I'm going to use a side-to-side, sort of gently rising to peaks, water motion sort of stroke. What I'm doing here is I'm going to first start to fill in a large part of the area with some marks that go side to side at a very distinct, different type of mark making than in the trees or in the sky. And when I do that, I'm trying to represent the way that water moves and feels. I also had myself with a fishing line cast into the water. I want to have some ripples coming off around that, and so I'm going to draw those in before I get too far along, just to help me remember where those are, where they should be, and give me the ability to emphasize them as I continue. Afterward, I'm going to fill in all the area that is water with the same sort of marks. I'm going to use more of the marks and make them a little bit skinnier and a little bit stronger as I head down the page. Remember, things that are close to us typically start lower on the page and appear larger than those things that are far from us. So the waves and the bits of current that we see are going to be more apparent, they're going to be larger, they're going to be deeper and more contrast of them as they get closer to us. So we want to keep that detail showing. Once I've finished with the majority of the water, I'm going to move on to the next section, and that's going to be the grasses that make up the rest of the marsh. Now, of course, grass we know grows from the ground up. We even did a whole practice exercise on making a grass sort of texture, so you should remember how to do this. But we're going to lay down a light pressure layer of a middly grass tone, something that I'm going to use as sort of yellow ochre is the artsy term for it, sort of a brownish yellow, very neutral, a little bit warm. I'm going to use that in a vertical single motion stroke. I'm going to not make zigzags, but instead make individual marks that start low and head upward. When I'm making these marks, I'm going to make them a little bit longer and a little bit bigger and a little bit more discreet and obvious as they approach the bottom of the page. Just like when we were making those waves and that ocean, that water texture, the closer the things are to us, the closer they look to the bottom of the page, they will appear closer to us, and thus they will appear larger. So again, keeping those marks as much as possible, a little bit longer, a little bit heavier. You might even use a medium pressure for some of the marks in the bottom section. And as you head up the page, your grass color texture should be getting lighter, shorter, and less distinct. Once I have done a fairly good job of covering the whole area of the grasses, then I'm going to take my clean blending stump and I'm going to blend everything. I'm going to try to keep the textures that I got started when I do my first layer of blending. I'm going to speed up a little bit here just to help you to see this a little bit faster. But as you see, I'm just blending, blending, blending. I'm going to be blending outward for the sky. And just like when I was coloring, I want to start with the background and work my way forward. So as I'm doing that, I'm going to just work my way across the sky. I'm going to take a little bit extra time and caution trying to define the top of the tree line a little bit. This is going to help me later on to avoid making too much of a mess. And this is why we do the background first and we do other elements after that. Now I'm going to blend the stuff above the clouds, the sky above the clouds, separately from when I blend the clouds themselves. This is going to give me the ability to make the clouds look like they are a different color, which of course they would be and they would appear to be when we see this sort of scene in real life. I'm going to blend in the foreground, I'm going to blend in the middle ground. Wherever I'm blending, I'm going to make sure that I keep the same direction of mark that I used when I was coloring when I blend. Otherwise, all that work that I used on making the marks and choosing them carefully is going to go out the window. Whenever I decide to switch to a new topic or a new area, or whenever I start to feel that my blending stump is getting too dirty, I'm going to clean it. So when I switch between blending the grassland and blending the water, I'm definitely going to clean it. In fact, I'm going to clean both sides of the blending stump. As I start to blend the water, I keep in mind once again continuing to make my blending marks the same directional strokes that I made my coloring marks. This way everything gets a little bit of blue, but I can still see some very distinct parts of the color. This is going to help to make this drawing end up looking really great. I'm going to use the tip of my blending stump especially carefully in and around the edges of the grass and around the figure in the kayak as well. Making sure to color in the whole area to blend the whole set of water to get it all to a nice even sort of at least base tone. When it comes to the trees, I'm actually going to blend across them just as often as I blend up and down with those. Normally, blending in the opposite direction that you colored will get rid of the marks that you made to give you less of the texture that you're looking for. But when we're trying to do trees, it's worthwhile because it also adds a little bit of side-to-side texture, and it helps to give the sort of hazy, foggy, misty unknowableness that the forest often has. Once I've completed that, and everything looks good and in order, I can start to see the textures. Then I'm going to go back in, once again, working from the background forward, and I'm going to put a heavy layer of pressure where I need it. The benefit of using a light layer first and a heavy layer second on top of it are several. One, you get to plan things out and see how it's going to look. You have to make adjustments. As you've seen several times while I've been making this composition, I've had to make a few changes here and there and correct for errors, and that's just part of the process. Having a light pressure layer adds a depth and interest to the picture. It helps to develop the textures and the things that really make our artwork more interesting to look at, more enjoyable, more satisfying to create as well. It lets us have a more comfortable and effective blending of colors, especially like up here in the sky where I'm working right now. And it's going to make it so that we can develop really effective textures. So it's very, very worth taking the time to put a light layer first and a heavier layer after. I think you're going to feel that way too once we get done. Once I have a nice heavy pressure layer all over the whole thing and I've got my colors mixed how I want them to show the general outline of where I want each of them, then I'm going to go in with a clean blending stump and I'm going to blend this. I'm going to start by continuing the direction of the marks that I made to make the coloring, but I also may well and often do work in the opposite direction to get rid of some of those marks. Sometimes what I want to do is make sure that the whole area is filled in with a really nice, bright, vibrant color. And that's really what one of the things that oil pastels can do a great job of. You can get bright, rich colors. And leaving some spots a little bit undercolored is just a shame. So I don't like to mess around with that. Sometimes, if your blending stump is messy, you will get a bit of an error, and that's something that you can blend out, you can color over, you can scratch away and fix up that way. There's a number of solutions, and ultimately, you could also color back in around it, or just not worry too much about it. Once I've got everything blended, and I am going to go in and fill all those little empty or shy or shallow spots and just get a nice smooth transition across all my colors. Then I'm going to come back and I'm going to look more carefully at the clouds. So I'm just making sure that everything is filled in, that everything is colorful, and that the transition from yellow to orange is smooth, from orange to red is great, and so on and so on and so on. Oil pastels are pretty malleable, which means you can move them quite a lot. So if I have a lot of areas like I do on this side that are a little bit lacking in color, I can spread what I've got around pretty far, which is a very nice feature. When it's time to look back at the clouds, I'm going to give them a base tone of a little bit of pink. Now, I see that most of the clouds are mostly in a black and blue area with a little bit in the violet or pinkish area. So, clouds often carry the colors of earlier stages of the sunset, meaning if I move back over toward the sun, if I look toward the right side of the page where the sun is setting, and I pick up some of those colors, maybe a little bit of orange, but a lot of that pink is going to carry in. I'm going to cover it with mostly a nice scumbly white to give a good feel for the texture and the sort of fluffiness of the clouds. I want them to be a little bit more blended, a little bit smoother in texture, but still have that scumbling feeling. And I often will want my clouds to be a little bit brighter on the bottom, more of the pink or yellow or orange showing, and a little bit darker on the top, which makes sense. They're catching the light of the sun on their bellies. Once I have my clouds in a nice way, I'm going to move on to the next step. Looking down, the next thing lower on the page is going to be the tree line. I'm going to start with a nice tree bark or tree trunk sort of color, kind of what we might call a raw umber, a nice warm orangey brown. I'm going to use that in a vertical mark just like tree trunks would grow, but I'm going to layer some other colors on top of it, so I'm leaving plenty of space and I'm making thin, skinny little lines. And I'm going to use some black and some dark brown on top of this because the tree line is not getting a lot of light, so it's probably going to be quite dark. So we want to make sure that it has that. This is the added benefit compositionally of having a strong contrast with how bright the water is and how bright the sun is especially. So this is going to make the whole area really pop nicely. I'm going to especially darken up the tops of the trees, and I'll use the darker brown in the lower sections of the area. I'm going to use several different colors, browns, greens, black, to develop a rich, interesting, textured, complex tree line that will be enjoyable to look at. When I blend these trees, I'm going to be very cautious that I am able to keep the blackness and the darkness of the tree line contained. I'm going to be careful and slow just around the top and bottom edges. The bottom, in fact, isn't even as important because I'm going to color over that and it's going to be fairly dark in that area. I still want to keep it cautious and not get it too messy, but I want to be especially careful of the top layer. Since I've already more or less finished the sky, I don't want to have to go back and fix it. As I start to look at how I'm going to continue coloring the water, one thing I want to keep in mind is getting a rough outline of where the sun might be reflecting off the water. So, since I know that things appear smaller as they get further from us, it makes sense that they're going to look bigger as they get closer to us. So the path that the sun is going to reflect off is going to be wider lower on the page. So I'm going to make kind of a trapezoid shaped angled ray of the sun heading toward the sun. And I'm going to use that just similar to the way that I made the peaks of waves with the blue before. I'm going to use a curving line in between several strokes crossing between each of the two borders of this trapezoid, the width of the sun at its narrowest base, and I'm going to make a bunch of what will eventually be the crests of waves or bits of current that are reflecting light off of them. Again, keeping this trapezoidal shape extending around and over part of the kayaker. Then I'm going to go into the top of the water, and I'm going to start with a scumbling motion with one other blue. I'm going to use at least 3 or 4 different blues, maybe some whites in here as well, to get a really rich, interesting, well-developed set of blues that make up the water and make it look really good. So I'm going to be scumbling this layer on after I already had the texture of the other layer. And we're going to see that some of it will show through and some of the scumbling will show through, and it will start to look interesting, natural way. Once I've scumbled most of the water surface, I'm going to go back in and emphasize the water texture in that sunbeam area. After that, I'm going to start to put a light pressure layer and then a bit heavier pressure layer on top of my kayak. I wanted to wait a while to let most of the texture around it develop without having too many disturbed areas. It's a lot harder to get the right texture and effect that we want in those areas, for instance, where the sunbeams are coming down, because we can't keep it consistent with the rest of the water. The more that we can keep things consistent, the easier it is to make them work out well. So I like to keep this area relatively free and clear for as long as I can. But now it's time for me to color this guy in. So I know the top of the kayak is a sort of ellipse shape with points on each end. It has a side that comes down. Most of it sits in the water. And I know roughly the shape of the body. Once I feel satisfied with the coloring on my character and kayak, I'm going to start to transition into the next layer of colors on the grass. When I use the grass, I'm going to use a nice yellow ochre, a brown of a sort of tannish brown, a green, and a very nice dark brown as well. I use at least 4 different colors. I'm going to be going over it in a few different layers. Now, what I'm going to be doing is starting as low as possible. This seems counterintuitive, but remember, things that start low on the page seem close to us. I want to start and set the highest of any of the grasses are going to be and have the greatest amount of detail and precision and time and focus and visibility on the things that are close to us that I'm not going to cover up with other layers after. So I'm going to use these colors first, using just a corner of each one, as we remember from our grass practice or fur texture practice. You're using the corner, starting low and making individual marks for each stroke, making a whole bunch of them, leaving space between them, just like you see me doing here. Once again, I'm making the grass that starts lowest the longest. I'm going to end up with about 3 different sections of grass, and there's going to be the closest bit, the medium bit, and the furthest bit. I'm going to have that on both sides, and you're going to see me making those chunks or blocks of grass each time. It can be a little bit hard to tell the difference, but these are all still that front area of grass. You'll notice that most of these are stopping either when they get to the water line or when they all get to a certain height. They all are about the same height. It's about, nearly half of the distance that we still need to cover. And I'm using all of the same sorts of height for all of my different colors. I'm layering in that green, that golden brown, that tan, that dark brown, just layering lots of these colors in over one another with the edges of the pastels. Once I have that first section well fleshed out, I'm going to make another section, and each of the strokes, the marks that make the different blades of grass in this section are going to be a little bit shorter. You'll notice that they are somewhere around 2/3 of the height of the original set. And I'm going to keep that pattern going, and I'll have, as you see, space for one more layer on top of this. So I'm going to color this layer with all those different colors, and you'll notice that each layer starts to go a lot quicker. You don't need to put as much detail. You can use a somewhat wider stroke with each layer, and ultimately we're going to do some more blending with these layers so they all sort of mix together and blend together anyway. That helps to make this part go a little bit quicker, just like you're seeing here. Somewhere around 2/3 of the height of the original set. And I'm going to keep that pattern going, and I'll have, as you see, space for one more layer on top of this. So I'm going to color this layer with all those different colors, and you'll notice that each layer starts to go a lot quicker. You don't need to put as much detail. You can use a somewhat wider stroke with each layer, and ultimately we're going to do some more blending with these layers so they all sort of mix together and blend together anyway. That helps to make this part go a little bit quicker, just like you're seeing here. When I move up to the final layer, you can see that I'm using even wider, shorter strokes with less space in between them, and these are also still a fairly light pressure, lighter than in the earlier layers of the grass. There are lots and lots of ways to make a background look good. This is certainly not the only way, but it's an effective technique to make the scene appear to be fading away from us and to still keep the grassy areas interesting and enjoyable to look at. when I blend the grasses, I'm going to do this in 3 stages. And I'm going to, on the lowest down section, the part that is the grass biggest, tallest, closest to us, lowest on the page, I'm not going to blend that really at all. In the middle section, I'm going to use a directional mark that continues the same pattern of mark making that I used when I was coloring. This way, as I blend, I will get rid of some of the detail of the grass, but it will still feel nice and grassy, and it will, as we remember in our compositional strategies, this is a focusing on the nearer grasses and letting the distant parts blur out more. And on the very far sections of grass, I'm going to blend very heavily. I'm going to start with the same up and down sort of motion, but I also will do some blending on a side-to-side motion to really fuzz these up. When I'm adding the darker blues and richer colors for the water, for the third layer of blues that I'm going to put onto the water, I'm going to go back to that original water texture, wavy sort of side-to-side curving line mark making that we remember from the first light pressure layer of water. And I'm going to run that all over the place. Just like before, having bigger, longer, more noticeable lines lower on the page, and having the lines be lighter pressure and blend in more and the higher sections of the page. And I'm going to make sure to have some of these dark lines around or in between the sun ray, and that's going to create this very realistic, fun effect of the water rippling around. Once I've got my coloring in, looking really sharp for the water, then I'm going to use a blending stump. I'm going to use a combination of a scumbling blending texture as well as following the side-to-side effect, capturing that motion of water feeling. And as things are further up or higher on the page, the very far distant parts of the water, those are going to be blended very smoothly with little texture showing, but mixing the colors well. And as we work down the page, we're going to have more and more detail, texture, wave effect showing. The last steps that I'm going to do in making this picture are to add in some more depth and darkness into the shadowy areas. So this is going to take some abstract thinking, and I'm going to imagine where the sun rays are hitting. Of course, we know that the sun rays, the light of the sun, is coming from the sun, which means that the side of objects closest to the sun will be the lightest part of those objects. That also means that things on the back of those objects, the far side of objects, is going to be the darker part of our composition. So, in areas where we have a jutting out part of the land and we have lumps of grass that sort of extend toward or into the water, those are spaces that we're going to imagine which side is the front, or the part closest to the sun, and which is the back, and we're going to darken up the back. We're going to use some dark brown and black strokes within the grass. We're going to use some dark blue and black within the water, and we're going to blend that all in so that the color of the water reflects and shows the shadows of the dark material, the dark objects above and growing up around them. Just like to make sure that the backside of every lump of grass or every jutting section of grass is darkened, as well as the water beneath the tree line, beneath those dark sections of grass, without going in and darkening up or putting shadows on the front side of the grass, the parts that are closest to the sun. And as you can see me putting some dark outlines, some darker grasses on the low part of the grass, wherever it grows, I'm not putting the black lines all the way to the top. I'm only using them right toward the bottom. And these little finishing touches are going to create deeper, better contrast and a much more interesting visual composition. Hopefully, if you followed along with all these videos, then you have created a really wonderful artwork, a masterpiece as well. Happy making, and let me know if you have any questions.